Lisa Lorenzetti, and I'm a social work student here, PhD student, also doing some teaching, and I've been involved in social justice work for the past 20-something years. I started out as an anti-apartheid activist in Montreal, and been involved in work around what's called the Oka crisis, but really was a huge infringement on human rights. And also been involved in lots of other work, and still developing my own authentic humanity, trying to be a more caring, empathetic, compassionate person. So I'm on that journey, and it's nice to be with all of you here today. I think that we have a pretty good turnout, and I want to commend everyone who went out last night and banged some pots and pans. Who was there last night? Woo! All right, way to go. Excellent. Good, and I think Calgary's just had a new infusion of activists and social justice energy, and it's very exciting. And I think that Calgary's long been known as a place where people don't care, people just care about their SUVs and bigger decks on their homes. But I think that's changing, and I think that we are proving to the world that we're a different kind of place, and a more welcoming, loving place for everybody. So thanks for being here today. I'm just going to be introducing people who are going to speak on our panel today, but prior to that, I would like to pass the pretend speaking mic over to Dr. Jackie Siebert, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Work, and he would like to welcome you and share a few words.
I would like to thank everybody for being here today. When Lisa proposed having a conversation today, I was actually away at a conference this last week, and I replied pretty quickly, I hope, with an email that said that if there's any place in our society where we should be able to have these honest conversations, it should be at universities. And so I was completely supportive of the meeting today, and I hope that it does go well. I also wanted to say to all of you that at the meeting that I was at over the last few days, there was a motion passed that relates to the conversation today. And the meeting that I was at, and Hugh, just down the table here, was at the same conference as well. It was a meeting of the Canadian Association of Social Work Education, and that is a body that accredits social work programs, including ours, across the country. It's a body that promotes social work education, and a body that meets once a year at an annual general meeting. And this week, on Monday, the student caucus of that organization had a full-day meeting, and they came to our AGM the next morning on Tuesday with a motion that asked for support from all of the delegates there from social work schools across the country, a motion in support of the rights and freedoms of the protesters who are protesting in Quebec. They brought forward a motion that was, I thought, very thoughtfully worded. It was a motion that asked for support for the rights and freedoms of all of those protesting. And so I wanted to be here today to let you know that it was passed unanimously by and that's a body that very rarely passes any motion unanimously. It's hard to get social workers to agree on many things, but this is one that people were very strongly supportive of. And it's also a motion that I thought the students did a phenomenal job on. So I'm hoping to set the tone for the conversation with that today.
Speakers today. First, I'd like to introduce Brian, who's on my far left. And Brian Seaman has been a research associate with the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre since November 2004. He has two major works in progress for the centre. One addresses the limits of multicultural accommodation in a liberal democracy, and one addresses increasing surveillance of our private lives and dwellings by agencies of the state, often rationalized as necessary intrusion in the interest of fighting crime or preventing acts of terrorism. So Brian's really well situated to be here today. Let me just see here. In addition to the writing for the ACLRC, Brian, that's the
Alberta Civil Liberties Research Centre.
Thank you. I always get the name mixed up. Brian's articles and commentaries have appeared in dozens. Brian's articles and commentaries have appeared in dozens of print and online media sources in Canada, South America, Europe, including Law Now, Abaledo, pero Family Rights, Journal, Migration Letters, Calgary Herald, and Avlog. You also write in Spanish, Brian?
No, I had a student who speaks fluent Spanish, and so she translated an article.
Oh, that's
for me.
great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And we published under a co-published arrangement.
Perfect. So welcome, Brian. And then we also have another sort of social work comrade here, Ed Lee. He's presently a doctoral candidate at the School of Social Work at McGill. He's also involved in migrant justice and LGBTQ newcomer community organizing. And yes, and as a graduate student, Ed has been involved with the student movement in Montreal, especially with respect to building a more anti-racist and anti-oppressive analysis with student organizing, which I think is great. Ed is also, we have to take some credit, also was a social work student here.
Yeah.
And so there you go. See, Calgary.
A decade ago.
All great things come from Calgary. It still counts for us. We have three other people that have offered some commentary, and I'd just like to introduce them. And I know that Jen Len's not feeling too well today, but she has a letter that she'd like to read from a student. Jennifer Leonard, also a social work student, a social worker. She's been an activist. She and her girls often are out at rallies with me and my girl, and they become friends. And I think that similar to lots of mothers, one of our biggest sort of activist work is how we bring up our children and giving them love, care, compassion, safety, and also social responsibility. So welcome everyone, and I think at this point I will turn things over to Ed, who's going to give, I think, a brief rundown of what's been happening on the ground in Montreal and some of his analysis.
Okay. So I'm not like incredibly prepared, but I'll do my best to kind of give a bit of a context before talking about some of the stuff that's been happening more recently. And so, yeah, I don't know how much people have been aware. I think what I've noticed, and I don't know about here in Calgary, but is that there's been a particular framing of what the issues have been within mainstream media that has been, there's been a lot of distortion that's happened, and I've seen it happen in Quebec. In particular in comparing the French versus the English media. And there have been differences. So the French media has been much more, there's been a more diversity of opinion within the mainstream sort of sources, whereas the English media in Montreal have been very one-sided for the most part, except for open letters that might be published at different periods of time. And so in Calgary, I don't know how has it been for you all here in terms of hearing about what it's been like in Quebec or in Montreal.
What's going on there?
Yeah, what's going on there?
Yeah, what's going on there?
I think it's hard to.
Yeah.
As someone who completely rejects mainstream media,
Yeah.
I've been getting lots of great updates via Facebook,
Yeah.
via
Yeah.
YouTube, and via streams like that.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for that,
Yeah.
when I do pick up the Sun or the Herald occasionally, and I read their verbal, very upsetting. We're talking. Especially in Calgary, Alberta, we are strong about our civil liberties.
Yeah.
And yet here's a great example where your civil liberties are being trampled upon, and rather than focusing on that,
Yeah.
we're going to focus on spoiled rich kids.
Right.
And I think that's a real travesty for what Alberta stands for.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think Michael is going to speak more about that too in terms of what's happening here and the kind of media that's being presented. And I think that's important before I even talk. Because I'm going to take like 15 minutes, not a lot of time, and I won't be able to cover everything, right? And just to say too that I'm just speaking for myself and as a student and as a social worker, community organizer, and so there's a diversity of opinion as well, right? In terms of the students who are involved or students who are not involved, and so just keep that in mind too. And so when I speak, it's not that I'm coming from this place of extreme authority. I'm just coming from a particular viewpoint with specific set of experiences. Yeah. Okay. And as I talk, if people have any questions or clarification, let me know, because I might brush over certain ideas that people might not be aware of. And so, I think one sort of important aspect at the very sort of core of what this issue is. So this idea of having a student strike I think is one that is really important. Like, we could talk for an hour and a half on the issue of what is a student strike, what does it mean, especially within the Quebec context, because there's this huge history, right? Historical context of student mobilizing in Quebec from the 60s, and so there's a lot there that I won't go into, but I think it's important to acknowledge that in understanding sort of the way that the student strike is understood in Quebec, is really specific. And in terms of the actual strike itself, so the idea that student associations have the right to mobilize, form a general assembly, and then vote, to strike or not to strike. I think that idea is sort of placed in tension or in conflict with this idea that individual students should have the right to attend classes, right, if they want. And so that's been sort of the key sort of tension, I think, that has operated in a lot of the cégeps and universities, right, that have had general assemblies. And every university will have a different sort of response. So, for example, UQAM, which is University of Quebec at Montréal, is a francophone public university, and for the most part, there hasn't been, almost every association has voted. Every association has voted to strike, with very little kind of dissent. There's been some, but not a lot. And then you have other universities like Université de Montréal and Concordia that where probably there's more students who have been in favor of the strike versus against, but it's it's definitely been a really diverse sort of diversity of opinion in terms of students. And then McGill, which is where I'm at, which I would say the majority of students are against the strike, but we have had general assemblies, and I think actually social work, the undergrad students, we have to give props to them because they're one of the few sort of undergrads that actually went on a strike, and in a really big way. And so their general assemblies produce between 70 to 100, over 100 students oftentimes, which is a huge amount of the student body, proportion of the student body, the undergrads. And they, for 6 weeks, they've continually voted in favor of the strike. And so I think, and there's a lot of dialogue within those general assemblies as well. So I think that's something that is quite amazing, because there was this idea that McGill couldn't strike, or it couldn't happen there, and it did. And so I think that's really, it's been really great to see that. And so yeah, I think that tension is really important to think about. So the rights of student associations to go on strike versus individual students' right to go to class. Yeah.
Just what makes McGill different that people thought the strikes wouldn't happen there?
That's a really it's a big question. Yeah.
It's having gone to McGill.
Yeah.
There's a real sense of elite university. I think having been there myself, I think I was one of the very few people I ever knew who had a real job, like working for school. I think there's a lot of privilege. I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, but absolutely it's seen as a privileged university. It's also seen as an Anglophone university, and I think that's part of the issue around Concordia. I think just general stereotypes is seen more as a working university, people's university, of people who have jobs and sort of are trying to get by. And I don't know if anyone would like to counter me on that if they've gone to McGill or Concordia, but there's sort of the common knowledge that there's a real difference in privilege.
Yeah, and I've gone to both. I've gone to both universities.
What would you say?
And yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
There is this sort of Concordia kind of grew on a business class, like in terms of working class, night classes.
Yes, yeah.
McGill, forget it.
Yeah.
You either commit for a full-time study or you don't deserve to be a student.
Yes.
I think that if that captures it, I'm not sure, but it's one element for sure. But divides then further the language issue. Like it's not francophone, anglophone, it's now divided even further.
And I was going to say too, and Ed, what do you think? But I think also McGill has a lot of international students and who are paying like 10 times the amount of those who were here. So I just wonder about, giving that up and going out on strike and having to explain that to families back home. I can imagine it can be quite difficult to do that.
I mean, I would say even like more than international students would be out of province students, right? So McGill, I think, has probably the most out of province students. And so there's a lot of students, a lot of out of province students have been in support of the strike too. Even at McGill, there's been a lot of mobilizing. But I think that there's also a huge amount of ignorance or lack of knowledge around the historical context of student organizing and student strikes in Quebec, and so people who are from out of province oftentimes don't really know, right? And there's also a lot who are from the US as well, who are international students, and so I think that also has an influence, although there are some US students who have been in support of the strike too.
And I think if you don't have that historical heritage, you don't have a responsibility to it necessarily.
Yeah.
You're there to study, whereas if you're a Quebecer and you're not in, with the movement, I mean, this is the ninth strike from 1968, so this is a real heritage, a rite of passage almost, it seems to think.
Yeah, and I think it's been harder to engage in that dialogue around with out-of-province students to talk about, because out-of-province students pay more, right, than Quebec students, and so I think that also is like, so how does this impact you, right, as an out-of-province student? I think having that kind of conversation has been important too, and I think it has happened, and the Faculty of Arts had a general assembly, huge general assembly, and there was like 600 in favor and 500 in support of the strike, 600 against the strike, and so there was actually a lot of people who were in favor of the strike too, right? And so it was actually closer than what I even thought it was going to be, and so so I do think that people are aware. It's just that, but there is a large number that weren't aware too, and so that dialogue, was important and maybe didn't happen enough as well. In terms of people understanding and also looking beyond tuition hikes, because the tuition increase is also attached with the university funding plan, right? And I was going to forward you the PowerPoint. The geography grads at Concordia did an amazing job of doing this PowerPoint presentation about it, and basically they're talking about sort of the requirement that the Quebec government is going to have on research being linked to non-government sort of funding, so basically corporate funding, right? And how research dollars, the only way to get research dollars, a certain amount, will be through, if you also have private funding as well. And so there's this sort of neoliberalization, right, of the universities that is already there, but is continuing further with this funding plan. And I think that has also been sort of a challenge too, is communicating what the issues are beyond the tuition hikes. Because that's one thing that's very direct and concrete that everybody can see and understand. But the university funding plan is also this other thing that's really, really important that everybody should understand it and know more about. And actually for me, like when I read the university funding plan, it further justifies sort of the reason for something like a student strike, because I think the way to understand or justify, from my opinion, a student strike is to understand the university as sort of an enterprise or an industry, right? And as students, not just as learners, but as producers, right? As people who produce knowledge, produce things, and so academic writing could be understood as labor as well. And also, I mean, in social work and other places, there's also internships and other things that happen where there's this really close relationship, right, between the university and broader society. So the university is not just a space for learning, even though it is that, but it's also this larger thing around it being this enterprise and this industry. And so I think the funding plan actually kind of just reinforces that idea. And so it further justifies the reason for why the students should have the right to go on strike, and the conflicts that come with that, so that, and there have been conflicts. Like when the social work students went on strike, they're picketing in front of classrooms and stuff, and it evoked a lot of conflict and emotions, and there was a lot of conflict. And for myself, I was a graduate student who was in favor of the student strike, but also a sessional instructor as well, and so it was a bit challenging for me too, to be able to find a way to kind of hear everybody's perspective, but also like know where I was coming from too, and just be transparent about that with people as well. And so, yeah.
So part of that, the accessibility of education, right?
Yeah.
So whether we'd argue that was a right or not, and who pay for it.
Yeah.
So has the Quebec government, Charest, has he countered that with saying, oh, we've upped the bursaries and the loan, it's all good?
Yes.
And that obviously is not appeasing anybody because of this larger agenda that you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Is that what you're seeing kind of on the ground?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So has done that, right?
Right, they counter by saying, what's your problem?
Up until yesterday, they refused to budge on the tuition increases. They're like, we're not going to budge on that. We're not going to negotiate around that. That's going to stay the same. And they moved it from 5 years to 7 years. And when you do that, the numbers actually, the amount that students had to pay actually increases, even though per year it's smaller. Yeah, I think and then they said we're going to up the loans and bursaries. I think at one point there was a set of negotiations that happened, and this was in beginning of March. So March, I think it was May 4th and 5th, so it was the 3 student associations, and then some union organizers. So three of the main sort of Montreal unions also participated, and then the government. And it was like this 24-hour sort of marathon, and that included the question of increased bursaries and funding and loans, and it was actually quite problematic. Like there afterwards, students, one of the students who were kind of connected with it, representing a student association, kind of talked about how there are certain clauses that, because everybody was so tired, that the negotiator actually changed at the very last minute. You would get this if you read the French media, right? But the Anglophone media doesn't talk about this at all. And so there are these last minute changes and then they just pressured the students to sign, and it was just this really kind of shoddy negotiation. And then the students actually brought that agreement to the student associations, and the student associations voted on it. And the 2 pieces about that were the increased bursaries and loans, and then the from 5 years to 7 years increase, and the students rejected that. Absolutely, yeah, because I think that they could see beyond that for sure. Yeah.
That was yesterday.
No, so that was May 4th and 5th that happened. And this is where it gets, interesting, is like the government passed the Law 78 on May the 15th, May the 16th, 17th, something around there, right? And so to me, that indicates a huge amount of bad faith in terms of the government and the Quebec government and its negotiations, because for sure they were developing that law while those negotiations were in place, right? Yeah. You can't come up with that kind of huge, expansive law in like a matter of a week, right? Mm-hmm. It takes time to develop, and so to me, like that just is a further demonstration of bad faith negotiations on the part of the
and I
government.
suspect Ryan's going to talk about this, but then it gets down to how you can actually evoke such a law, and it is under status and circumstance, one of which is that there is sort of a last measure. Is that true? So if they're kind of working behind the scenes and kind of crafting this. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are definitely, like when I was trying to pull together some of the video clips and media stuff, sort of in the lead up to this law, and I sent it to you. There's a few things where I was like, there are certain pieces that happened, and the negotiations were a part of it. Also, the protesting that happened before and then in the lead up around the time of the negotiations as well, I think was really important. And it's important to know too that like the kinds of sort of police violence that was happening towards the protesters were happening before Law 78 happened, right? And part of the justification for the law was this idea that the students are violent, right? And so there's this sort of demonizing that happened of all students, that they're all violent, and I think that ended up justifying the law as well. And so I don't know if did I get to people's questions on that? Yeah. Okay. So I think I guess I'll just talk about a couple more quick things. because it kind of leads into more description about Bill 78, this law, and what it's about and its implications. And so I guess one thing is to just remember, for those of us who are in organizing, and social workers and students as well, is that the changes that happened and the movement that's happened and the way that it's grown as well has grown through struggle. So I think it is a movement that is very much shaped by compassion and caring, and the sense that the students who are striking aren't actually necessarily going to benefit from striking either, right? Because they're going to be graduating by the time the full kind of tuition increase will have come. And so there is this level of compassion that's there, I think, that's pushing the movement, but it's also been a movement of struggle as well. And so, there has been a lot of institutional repression within universities through the use of injunctions and other means, and also this sort of repression from the government through the use of police and limiting of protest and peaceful assembly. And I think that it's important to know.
So I was just wondering about the of the faculty or how the instructors are responding. Is there anything coming from that end?
Yeah. So every unit is different, okay? And in terms of social work, I mean every faculty is going to be different. But the responses have been varying. So at UQAM and UDM, my understanding is that almost nearly all of the faculty were in support, and like the minute UQAM had a strike, the faculty organized like a panel sit-in, teach-in thing right after, and had a conversation about it. And the social work associations, faculties are at McGill, UDM, and UQAM. So Concordia doesn't have a social work faculty. And UDM, I think, also was very supportive as well. For the most part, I'm sure that there are some faculty who disagree too. McGill was a different story, and so I would say the vast majority were either some were in favor of the tuition hikes. There are some who are against the tuition hikes, but didn't feel like the student strike was an appropriate method, or that it worked in the McGill context. And then there was this kind of like a smaller number that were for in support of the student strike as well. So it was definitely varying. And I think that, like, if I'm just to be transparent, I think that was one of the things that was really hard for students, actually. The undergrad students at McGill in particular, was this sense that they weren't necessarily getting the kind of faculty support that they were expecting or wanting. But I also think that kind of that sparked a lot of dialogue as well. And so the students did these amazing things, like both the undergrads and some graduate students, around fostering dialogue with faculty members and amongst their peers too. And so the way that they decided to strike also, they thought about it in the context of McGill too. And so, for example, they picketed, but they didn't block the doors. So they allowed students to go in. And I think there are certain decisions that they made, and they all decided to continue on with their stages, for example. So there are decisions that they made based on the context of which they were in. So I think if there are students at UQAM, it would have been a different scenario, and they would have had a different range of options. But I think in the context of McGill, they made some really good strategic choices too, and there was dialogue that happened as well. Yeah.
With respect to blocking of students going to class, I've run into a lot of people taking issue with that, and I feel that a lot of people don't understand. You talked about how it's a place of production too, and how the term scabs and the labor and working class play into that, and how maybe if people understood more what it actually means to be a scab, that they would understand better.
Yeah. And I think that go ahead.
No, and I think on that point, I think it's a valid point. And I wonder, Ed, if you can speak to that one issue, if we have time, is it a strike or is it a boycott?
Yeah.
And I know, when we talk about strike, we throw that word around quite loosely. But I think it's an important distinction because it's entrenched in labor law and strike and scabs. To boycott is not, and to cross is not a scab. You know, so I just wondered if that was an important nuance, or has it been settled, I guess, because it keeps people who argue it's not a strike. You can boycott, you can buy a product, and you can, like a Walmart, we don't have to shop at Walmart, or we can have a product and not use it. We can't, I don't think, can we strike?
But I think this goes back to what you said, that it's not just a place of learning, it's a place of action too.
True.
So I don't know whether you want to transition. Maybe I'll just I'll respond to that really quick. And then we can move on to also the implications of Bill 78 and maybe come back to this conversation too. And also strategize, right? I think the thing about the issue around strike versus boycott, very clearly, those who were in favor of the student strike called it a strike. Those who were against the student strike called it a boycott. I mean, right? And I think that it also speaks to the underpinnings of how people understand what students are and what university is. And I think that's where this idea of university as industry and students as laborers has this historical sort of acknowledgement in Quebec that is much more acknowledged, right? And so there's much less sort of argument that students should not be seen as strikers because of this sort of these sort of actions happening for decades, right? And I think that's where, if this student movement is going to sort of move beyond Quebec and engaging with these kinds of actions, so student strikes, outside of Quebec, then this idea of university as a site of labor is really, really important to be able to justify a strike, right? Because then when you can make that shift, then you can start talking about what happens in union organizing and how even within unions, there has been a lot of conflict with people wanting to, cross the picket line versus not, and that kind of thing, right? And then unions have historically across Canada explained and justified reasons for why they need to make collective decisions, even if some people within that union don't agree, right, with those decisions. And so I think when you can shift the conversation into that realm, then
so I'll just pass it over and then most of you.
So maybe we'll give the mic to Brian and then we'll delve back into the discussion.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me thank and the Faculty of Social Work for organizing this event, and also I'm glad to hear Ed's perspective as somebody who was on the ground and can give us a bird's eye view, so to speak, of what's been taking place in Quebec and Montreal in particular over the past several weeks and months. So I'm going to talk about three main areas. I'm going to be discussing, first of all, the importance of dissent in democratic society and in Canada in particular, in terms of bringing us to where we are today, a country which has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which indeed is a model for the world. Chile, for example, modeled its Charter of Rights following the end of dictatorship there. Their charter is based on our charter. The Charter of the European Union reads virtually word for word as our charter does. And secondly, I'm going to be speaking about Bill 78, Law 78, and talking about the sections which I think are offensive to the charter, and I'll be discussing why I think that the Law 78 would not survive a charter challenge. And third, I'm going to step outside of my area of expertise, if you will, and speculate as to why I think that the government of Quebec brought in Law 78 in the first place. So, why is dissent important to a liberal democracy and to Canada in particular? Well, we're sitting here today, a country where everyone is equal before and under the law. We have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees rights and freedoms to everyone, irrespective of gender, racial, ethnic background, sexual orientation. And it's unfortunate that so many people seem to take this for granted, because indeed we did not arrive at this place, and it's far from perfect. Obviously, we still have work to go to achieve equality for all Canadians. But it's what I think is the best in the world, and we're still working towards improving equality for all persons. But we didn't arrive at this state because, things magically were handed down from, God or, the powers that be. Indeed, when you look at the history of this country, as I look around the room, there are most people in this room, when this country was formed in 1867, did not have the right to vote, and indeed 2/3 of the people in this room who are women weren't even regarded as legal persons, so you couldn't vote, you couldn't hold elected office, and in many ways women were considered to be properties of their husbands or fathers. The only people who had the right to vote in 1867 were men, and indeed the majority of men did not even have the right to vote in 1867. If you were non-white, you did not have the right to vote, and indeed if you didn't own real property, you did not have the right to vote. So we have come to this stage because of the willingness of people throughout the history of this country to, in some instances, even risk their lives, and indeed there were people paid with their lives in getting us to this point where we have the right to assemble and form unions, laborers have the right to form unions, women have the right to vote, and indeed people have the right to participate fully in the political, economic, and social spheres of this country without being discriminated against because of race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. Secondly, I'll just talk now about Law 78 and the problems which I see with this law. I don't think it would survive a charter challenge. There's a lot that's wrong with this bill, but I'll restrict my comments to 3 areas in particular. Sections 13 and 14, which address the freedom of association, or in this case, the restrictions on the freedom of association of students and the right to peacefully protest at institutions. And secondly, I'm going to talk about Division 3 of the Act, which concern provisions they say to maintain peace, order, and public security. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about a section which presumes that student associations are responsible for damage and assault unless they prove otherwise. Sections 13 and 14 of the Act essentially are denying to students, or indeed to anyone, the right to peacefully assemble and protest, not only within the confines of campus, but it says within 50 meters of the outer limits of such grounds. This is overarching, and it is offensive to the right to peacefully assemble. I discussed these particular sections with colleagues, civil libertarian colleagues, before coming here today, and we automatically identified the offensive provisions within this section. And the question that was begging in my mind and my colleagues' mind was, why was this act even brought in when indeed we have the Criminal Code of Canada? It's against the law to cause a disturbance in public. It's against the law to assault somebody. It's against the law to interfere with somebody else's right to come and go as they please. And we're wondering, why, if the authorities had evidence of, we don't even know whether there were students or not. I mean, there was mass protesters 3 or 4 weeks ago burst into classes and were roughing people up. Who knows? Some of these people may have been agents provocateurs for all we know. We don't know. But, if we had these acts, we have a Criminal Code of Canada which can deal with these actions. So why was this act brought into place in the first place? I'm going to get back to some speculation as to why this was brought in a few minutes. Division 3 of this Law 78, it requires, under these sections here, requires any group of 10 or more persons. It specifically says that you have to apply to the police for permit to have a demonstration or protest march or whatever, and you've got to provide details of the route or whatever. This is obviously contrary to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because we do have a right under the Charter's fundamental right under Section 2 to the freedom of peaceful assembly. Now, interesting enough, Alberta, with some justification, but I think we have to say as Albertans that parts of the country don't fully understand what Alberta is all about. We're portrayed, I think, in central Canadian media as being kind of redneck and not caring about rights, but everybody in this room does care about rights. Curious enough, we don't have in this city, which is supposed to be this sort of conservative city, We don't have anything, any bylaw which requires people to notify the police in advance of a demonstration. In fact, we had a demonstration here, the pots and pans, the casserole demonstration the other night, and there were no arrests made, and it progressed peacefully. We have a right to do that in this country. We have a right to do that in Quebec. But we have this law in Quebec which restricts that right, which I don't think would survive a charter challenge. The third area which I want to address, which I think is terribly offensive to not only charter, but indeed is offensive to the fundamental right under English common law to be presumed innocent till proven guilty. Section 22, which says that a student association or federation of associations, and indeed any student which belongs to these associations, are responsible for any damages caused to a person, to property, etc., unless they can prove that the damage was not their responsibility. Well, we have a right under the law to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. Why? It's not because we want to make the job of the police difficult. It's because of the incredible power of the state. When you're suspected of a crime, you can be picked up and questioned, you can be arrested and charged. We have this incredible power of the state. We value individual liberty highly in this country. Therefore, we have a system which makes the state work to prove that you're guilty of a crime. This would not survive the charter challenge. Any one of these three areas would not survive a charter challenge. Therefore, I'm going to speculate. If there was ever a charter challenge launched to any section of this act, or indeed to the act itself, who knows how a court might decide, but I would be shocked if any court in this country would uphold an act which is so offensive to the charter in so many ways. Finally, I want to make my comments brief so we can have a good discussion, because obviously there's a lot to be said, and we saw some evidence of that during Ed's talk. He took a lot of questions. Why would the Sharia government bring in an act that is so offensive to the charter, when indeed, from a pragmatic policing perspective, we already have the Criminal Code of Canada with its sections against causing a disturbance, trespassing, damaging property, harassing, or assaulting people. I'm going to throw this out for speculation. You have a government which is struggling in the opinion polls. I've been following the opinion polls for the past several months, and the opinion polls indicate, project anywhere from a very strong minority PQ government to indeed a majority PQ government as recent as a week ago. The PQ would have won an election, were it called, a week ago. I'm wondering whether the government may have cynically decided to play some politics here and indeed help to engineer a crisis. That's my speculation. John Charest is a lawyer. Many politicians are lawyers. I can't imagine that they haven't heard tell of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So why would they brought in an act which is so offensive to the Charter? I can only speculate that it was brought in for cynical political reasons, to an attempt to manage or gain some political traction from this crisis by appearing to be tough on, some students. Those are my comments. I wanted to be brief so we could have some discussion, and I'll take any questions if anybody wants to jump in.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that was very, very, very informative and frightening at the same time. I just wanted to talk just very briefly about what we can do, and specifically engaging with mainstream media, because I heard your point, and it's frustrating because we think all the mainstream media they've been bought and they don't give a damn and all that stuff. But I think it's really important that we don't shut ourselves off. We have to engage. We must engage. We have a responsibility to engage, and I think I've handed out an article. This actually, some of you may be familiar with Chris Katarski. He's actually a graduate from here, Military Strategic Studies. He's a really enlightened writer. He writes regularly for the Herald, and so he was published earlier this week about this very issue. And read this. I love the last paragraph. It says, according to Abacus polling, every group except those 60 and older and Quebecers whose tuition rates remain comparatively low overwhelmingly think that Canadian tuition rates are too high in their province. If this is the case, then why disparage young Quebecers for wanting to keep post-secondary education affordable? Why not disparage the politicians in other provinces who shredded this particular part of Canada's social contract in favor of tax cuts about a generation ago? So what I would just really encourage you to do is, I like what you said, you get a lot of your information from Facebook and Twitter and social media, and then you put stuff out there as well, and we all know that's a very, very effective way of getting out to people. And at the same time, I would also encourage you to write letters to the newspaper, call into the talk shows, call the Herald and suggest you want to write an op-ed piece. I mean, we should be writing about not only the tuition hike, but about the Bill 78 and just how completely unjust it is. So that's basically just what I wanted to share with you. And just very quickly, there's a John Lennon quote that I really like here. It says, "When it gets down to having to use violence, then you are playing the system's game. The establishment will irritate you, pull your beard, flip your face to make you fight, because once they've got you violent, then they know how to handle you. The only thing they don't know how to handle is non-violence and humor." John Lennon. So with that, I just want to thank Grant and thank everybody who was there last night for the casserole rally, and encourage you to keep getting out there, engaging with people, keep the dialogue going through media, through social media, and dialogue with your friends, your peers. And I think we this is a much bigger issue. It reminds me a lot about the G20 summit as well, and the injustices that we saw there a couple of years ago with martial law.
And the injustices that continue in terms of not resolving that.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for coming in, you guys. Great. Open it up.
I just wanted to, I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here, not intending to be offensive, but intending to promote more dialogue. And I'm going to speculate on your speculation that the reason why you speculate may have to do with a lack of class analysis in respect to the creation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And from my perspective, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created in the context of making it easier for the production model, which is the external force, or external facade of the state, our capitalist system. We all know that when we go to work, if it's easier for us to work, then we'll do it more willingly. I remember when I used to work back in Cape Breton, we weren't allowed to listen to music, and we all got pissed off. But when we got to listen to music, it made it a little easier. So this is the context in which I think the Charter of Rights and Freedoms has been created. It's not a document of inalienable rights, I don't think. From my own experience, I'm not somebody that wants a bigger piece of the pie. I don't want bigger pages and longer chains. I want revolution now. And as a result, I have had that taken away from me. It's like, oh, you're a poor middle class or poor working class woman who wants a bigger piece of the pie. Here, you can have the charter given to you. But if you're an anarchist, who's a thorn in the side of the state, we're going to take that away from you. So I think that needs to be discussed more. And secondly, I would say that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as created in the context of Canada, has excluded Montreal, has excluded Quebecois, have excluded the Francophone. And when we discuss this as some kind of birthright of Canadians, it, from my perspective, borders on bigotry.
Well, I don't agree with you, obviously. If you are a self-identified anarchist, you have a right to express an opinion. That doesn't mean that I have to agree with it. And I suggest that most Canadians wouldn't agree with it. I mean, anarchy, as I understand it, means the absence of law altogether. And I think that a necessary component of freedom is a civil society. I think that the civil society that we have permits freedom, and anarchy to me is the absence of law. And
I think you're deviating. It's not about a question of anarchy or not. It's about the Constitution. I think.
Pardon?
Sorry about that.
No, and secondly, in terms of Quebec being excluded, I realize that's a myth that has been propagated in certain circles in Quebec for the past three decades. But indeed,
Charter of Rights and Freedoms is virtually identical, word for word, to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So people in Quebec have enjoyed the same rights and freedoms that people throughout the country have enjoyed. And indeed, I don't regard the Charter as being some kind of a radical departure from Canadian history either. I mean, its critics certainly do. I mean, we have a Prime Minister who really gave it, I think I'm being generous here, lukewarm endorsement or reception, you know, on its anniversary. He described it as a controversial and flawed document. I mean, there are people in Western Canada, not only in Western Canada, but this seems to find a certain resonance here amongst conservatives in Western Canada in any event, that this was some kind of a foreign document that was rammed down Canadians' throats. When indeed, when you look at the history of Canada, through protest, through you know, protests like, for example, the Winnipeg General Strike, which was an example of workers coming together to protest, and you know, there were men who lost their lives fighting for the right to assemble and to protest. I mean, labor law has advanced through strikes, general strikes throughout history, and there is freedom of assembly within the Charter, which covers unions. So I don't think that it's some kind of a exclusionary document. I think Quebecers have enjoyed the benefits of it, and I don't agree with you know, the sentiment that they were somehow excluded, because I think that certainly there's people in Quebec you know, who would be supporters of the PQ, not all of them, but many of them who would take that position, but it's only for political reasons, because they're playing to their own you know, local populace or supporters, just like Harper plays to his local base here, who think that Pierre Trudeau was some kind of a, you know, Fidel-loving communist who you know, hated Alberta.
Maybe just to add on to this dialogue, which is making me think of this other sort of issue that's been conversations that I've been having with a lot of students, and it kind of addresses both in a kind of indirect way. But you know, one of the things that a lot of students who I've had conversations with, especially students who are Canadian citizens, is this sort of surprise that they have been politically profiled, right? So whether it's within the institution, so like students who have said, okay, now that I have a red square on, security's following me around, right? Or security are being called on me, and then also on the streets too, right? And so like, I participated in one of the protests, the marches, one of the night marches, like the day after Law 78, and we're marching like thousands of people, just marching peacefully, and within 45 minutes, there was sound bombs, people were like running everywhere, and I think from what I understand afterwards, the people at the front and the back were harmed, right? Were assaulted by the police, and they were actually non-students, so they were like older people who were in support of the student movement, and were in opposition of the law. And the conversation that I often have is because a lot of students are really surprised, right? Because they think, well, we have our rights and freedoms, and this goes against it, and how can this happen? And you know, I usually try to remind students that even though we have this charter and that we struggle, it happened through struggle. So it happened through people's struggle for this charter to happen. You know, it doesn't mean that oppression doesn't happen, right? Or that there are certain things that go beyond the charter. So you know, in Montreal, you know, there's a huge amount of racial profiling, for example, right? And so and that racial profiling over decades have resulted in racialized people being killed, right? In January of this year, there was a refugee who was killed by the police in January, right?
I'm sorry, I was born in Alberta,
Yeah.
raised here. No. Are you just saying in general that the police are very brutal to foreigners?
So, yeah, so what, I guess the basic idea of racial profiling is this idea that specific groups of people, you know, based on the color of their skin and their location where they're situated. So it oftentimes happens in low-income, racialized communities, but there's a higher amount of police surveillance within those communities.
So that's not just a Calgary thing.
No.
Sorry.
Yeah, but just, you you know, and I think what that allows people is it allows people to realize, okay, like, you know, yes, like there has been this incredible amount of police and state violence towards protesters, and at the same time, that kind of state violence is, you know, happened before and continues, right, within racialized communities. You know, in Montreal, it happened before, you know, the protest happened before Bill 78 and after as well, right, and during. And so, and I think that also, it allowed people to have this sort of really deeper understanding of what racial profiling is and how it can impact somebody, and this realization that for students, that's a very temporary location. So at some point you're going to graduate, you're going to leave or whatever. When you're racialized, you know, you can't change the color of your skin, right? And so, you know, you can't necessarily avoid entirely being racially profiled. So I think that, you know, that was really helpful to talk about how horrible it is, how political profiling is horrible, and at the same time, you know, how these kinds of things, you know, continue to happen, even though we do have a charter that is really important. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to elaborate. I think when Aaron said it's not it's not really an inalienable right, that's more what he meant. Not legally, yes, like as citizens, that is, the charter is our right, it's our rights and freedoms, but the reality and the perception is often quite different.
And to go beyond that, I just wanted to say that, you know, in the context of what I perceive as our social contract, post-war social contract being dead, neoliberal capitalism doesn't need this document anymore to be productive. Whereas why this resonates so much with Quebecers is because they fought the Quiet Revolution in the 60s and the 70s. They looked towards, you know, Europe and post-war Europe that had some ethos of collectivism rather than the neoliberalism of the states to build a model upon. So that's where the last semblance of this social contract is still alive. And that's what I think is happening, is that neoliberal capitalism said, we don't need this document anymore. It was just made to make it easier for these workers to work. Now we got the heavy fist of the state, and we'll use it, and we don't care.
If that's true, and I'm not sure it is, I think it's important to stress that it's up to the people then, because I've always regarded the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a people's document. You did say something which resonates extremely strong with me. You at some point you used the term, well, you know, these aren't really inalienable rights. You know what? I think that's important to address and keep in mind that
these rights did not come about because, you know, as I said at one point, you know, some mythical god handed them down from us, or, you know, Moses handed them down from the mountain or whatever. They came about because a recognition of the historical fact that there were groups of people who were excluded from the social and political fabric of this country decades ago, who were willing to put their personal security in the line to protest and to step out from the accepted norm, if you will, and change came about as a result. When we start to take rights for granted, I think that the democracy that we have and take for granted is in danger. Secondly, you know, your reference to the social contract being broken, if not dead, except for perhaps in the province of Quebec. For quite some time, I've been thinking about how, you know, we are seeing the erosion of the social contract. I mean, you know, people 30 years and younger now are faced with an incredible debt load. I mean, they're being told, well, you know, you just have to accept the fact you're going to have to work longer and harder to pay for, you know, the retirement of your seniors. And I think we are, you know, we've got people working until they're in their late 20s, even early 30s, for corporations, for organizations, as interns. You know, and they're being asked to accept that this is just the way it is. I mean, I can remember, it was, when did I first start hearing about unpaid internships? Maybe 15 years ago? You know? I mean, you're essentially asking an entire generation to be like indentured servants until they're well into their 30s, and that is simply wrong.
I'd lay up because I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to talk. There's a question or comment here, and then you're after.
I read over Bill 78, and there was something that stood out for me on it, which sort of, the way I read it, looked like the sinister underbelly of this whole document. And it was that the bill requires students' associations, unions representing teachers, and college or university employees to employ appropriate means to induce their members to comply with its provisions or face prosecution. Now that to me says that if I don't watch my neighbour and make sure he's doing right, then I'm in big trouble, so I better do that, to put it bluntly.
It's quite Orwellian, isn't it?
And when you were mentioning the challenges to this, that didn't come up, and I'm just wondering, has it come up? Has it been given?
Do you have a section
Sorry, which
information number so
section
we could
was that? So
I don't. I took pieces out of it.
I read an article
It's where the form of gathering by strike supporters within 50 metres is that same section, and anybody that doesn't induce them to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ed may know more on this than I do, but I do recall reading an article before coming in here today. There is a charter challenge, in the works. I think one of the unions. Is that not correct? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But it hasn't come.
There's, like, so many
Yeah. So.
The group of
And-
lawyers, I think, in Quebec are meeting,
Yeah.
maybe as we speak, and there are about 70 organizations that are going to be challenging it.
wow.
I think
So
that's
don't quote me, but don't record that.
There's hundreds of lawyers who walked in their gowns,
Yes.
and they demonstrated. They marched on the streets.
Oh, really?
too. Yeah.
They just
Yeah.
like their skin.
And just another thing to keep in mind is that it's actually they made it so it would be in effect for a year, and so people are thinking that that they did that because they know that the charter, won't
Get to the
pass.
courts.
Yeah.
Oh,
And so I
yeah.
think that's another sort of thing that people have said is that okay, they presented it only for a year because they know that it
Right.
won't withstand.
Well, and also, Brian, you're so skeptical. Can't believe you'd say that about the federal government. We'd actually implement a law to detract. But I'll add to that a little bit for you. And keep in mind, too, that I think it's the Charbonneau Commission right now, where there's a commission where they're investigating the Charest government, the Montreal government, the municipal government about corruption. And so people have suggested, wow, good detraction. I mean, Charest has been there for 9 years, tired and old, and people are tired, and there's people kind of nipping at the heels, right? There are other political parties that are saying no, tuition freeze, or
There's also something else too, that 1 year time frame. I'd forgotten about that. Thanks for bringing it up, Ed. But I mean, Quebec has to have an election within a year too.
Yes.
So I mean, I'm very suspicious about the motivation of the charter.
I think you should be. I think you're right to suggest that. I don't think that's overly discussed.
Yeah.
We have somebody who's been waiting a while. Go ahead.
Yeah, my comments are discreet but connected, and it goes back to the debate you guys were having about the Bill of Rights and how it stands. And my first one is, I think that it comes from two different points of view of analysis. Like, you're coming from more of an economic Marxist background, which sees these things as being produced from an economic base, and you're coming from more of a law background, so you're kind of analyzing it with reference to the law as a structure, so a vertical sort of approach. But I think regardless, you have to say that these rights are contingent things, and one of my favorite philosophers, actually, just coming from a philosophical background, Jacques Lancer, said that unless you can make reference to these abstract rights in situations like the Quebec students, they're not really concrete. It's like, unless we can actually make reference to them in times when we're being excluded from them, we can't really see them as concrete things. So I'm not sure if that would kind of provoke a response, or...
Can I expand on that just briefly? One thing I wrote down about the right to form a union and it being an abstract right. What is the point to have a right to form a union if the Minister of Labor will just order you back to work? The message is being sent to these companies, don't negotiate, we'll order you back to work. So we have the right, but it's so abstract because it's powerless.
But we have to make the ability to make the reference to those rights outside of the law. Like, you have to say that these rights stand above the law itself as an institution because they were produced by it and they're produced by the economic background, but we have to still reference them to be able to make them concrete, to be able to change like the material conditions. I think that's a good point.
I mean, this is where I really hope that, and it seems like it's, part of what Bill 78 has done is made it more concrete around like how certain rights can be taken away like that, right? And how everybody is realizing that, not just in Quebec, but also outside of Quebec as well, right? Which is where we're seeing all of these sort of larger protests in solidarity with the student movement. And even, I think, even folks in Quebec, like, there are a certain number who are not necessarily in favor of the student strike either, right? and were kind of either in the middle or kind of could see both sides, or were, had a hard time sort of sticking in position. But once Bill 78 came in, like, people were like, oh, there's sort of this whole other layer there that, where it's affecting more and more people, and I think people are starting to realize that. And hopefully, I think that over the past couple of months, like, the dialogue has gone from, tuition increases to sort of more neoliberal policies, right? And how they impact people, and whether it's within Quebec or in Canada. And for me, like, my own struggle has been, because I'm really rooted in sort of the migrant justice organizing, is to try to build links between the migrant justice organizing and what's happening with the students, and how there is this sort of neoliberal turn in immigration policies, right? And so especially in respect to refugees as well, there's been this huge, are these bills like Bill C-31, for example, that will basically result in more refugees being refused, and it will result in death, right? There's a federal interim health care that's being cut as well, and it will result in people dying. But it's also linked to this neoliberal policy, right? So if you're not understood as somebody who can contribute in an economic way to Canada's well-being, then you're not necessarily going to be valuable, right? And refugees, they don't come because they can contribute to the economy. They're coming because of specific international, criteria around fearing persecution, right? And so, yeah, I think that there has been sort of this opening as well in Quebec around sort of making the connection between the students' right and sort of, this idea of what kind of society do we want. And hopefully it's also probably kind of touching a chord that people already had, as maybe a sentiment that people already had as well, and people already thinking about, and yeah, which is good. Like, it's exciting to see.
And one of the things that just is continually deeply ironic in all this is these people who, the neocons, it's the emphasis on, it's all about fiscal economy. That is the thing that drives everything. And yet they do the stuff that is worse for the fiscal economy. Because those refugees consistently, in the long term, typically after about 10, 15 years, are net economic gains for the country. Education is a net economic gain for the country. And yet these are things that they slash. They're slashing the long-term economic viability of this country when they attack these things.
Okay, so the question then for me is, okay, so what now? Like, what do we do, right? Because it's not like this divisive, dichotomous kind of neocons versus, it's kind of the middle ground that, like you were saying, Bill 78 really served to galvanize and as a catalyst for people to look at those kind of larger rights that we've fought and struggled for so long. How do we, not convince people, but how do we dialogue, not just amongst ourselves, but when we're out there? And I mean,
can I give you an example of what I did today?
Sure.
I've been referenced this as the Red Square movement because I noticed there's Western bigotry towards Quebec, and that we as Quebec, like Nikita Khrushchev once said that revolutions are not made for export. This resonates with Quebecers because they've lived the experience of the Cultural Revolution and throwing off the yoke of Anglo oppression and the hegemony of the Catholic Church. That hasn't happened here. It won't resonate in the same way, so we have to make it our own. So when I'm talking to people, I talk about the Red Square movement and what it means to me and how I'm squarely in the bread. How are you squarely in the bread? Leonard once said we must fight oppression everywhere. These people that are in their 6,000 square foot houses and their 2-car garages, they're still on that same hamster wheel. And a lot of them want to get off it, but they're too scared to say because they want to keep up with the Joneses and they don't want to face the repression when they tell their neighbor, I don't want this anymore. So we need to make it their own and say that this resonates with me because of this, and maybe it can resonate with you better.
A comment I'd like to make a segue on that is, and that's addressing your questions, how do we engage people? I think we talk to people who are not living in the 6,000 square foot homes in Mount Royal or Turner Valley or whatever, which is most Albertans. Okay, the average wage I've read, the average salary in this province is what, something like, I don't know, $50,000, $60,000 we'll say. That's not the question. The question is, what is the median salary in this province?
Right.
And it's down around $25,000 to $30,000. You know, there are people in this province who are making scandalous amounts of money. There are people in this province who are making, you know, in bonuses, what would put them in the top 4% or 3% of wage earners in this province. The vast majority of Albertans are not benefiting, you know, from this oil addiction that we have here. And I mean, the people who are benefiting from it the most, I'd hazard to guess, aren't even living in this province. They're retired, or they're living down in Arizona or wherever. So we have to gauge our peers. And, you know, so the next time you hear some guy going on about, you know, yeah, those libtard leftist freaks and that damn Charter of Rights and Freedoms, engage them in dialogue instead of, you know, and I'm working on this. I mean, I'm at my best when I don't react angrily.
Right.
You know, and, you know, I feel like throttling some guy and saying, you know, how are you benefiting from $150 a barrel for oil? You know, I mean, you're driving a 10-year-old truck, and you know, you'd think that Ezra Levant is God, but I mean, he's not. You know, at people like you.
But like as activists, then what do we do? Like I know I get that, and like, you know, talking is good, and I think most of us probably talk quite a bit. But actively,
I think that's
you know, our activists in the room. I mean, what's kind of the next steps?
I think we need a general assembly.
Which is good, Lisa. Good start.
It's a good
today.
point. Yes, thank you. And it's good to talk about that, because I think we're coming around 1:30. Some people will have to leave, and others can stay on and discuss a bit more. And gentlemen, we didn't give you a chance to.
You know what? It's okay. It's,
sorry about that.
This is good. No, not at all.
Good. And so I think there's lots of things that are happening in Calgary. We've got the activist network back up again and very active. And there's lots of great work. So how do people want to talk for a few minutes about what they're doing personally and collectively around linking into this? Because a lot of us are doing things that link directly with this work. And I'm trying to keep quiet, because I'm a Montrealer, so I don't know about you, but I'm trying to keep quiet about the history of Quebec and some of the movie. I know, just keep quiet. But anyway, it's not about that. And so I think
we'll meet for lunch.
We'll go for lunch. But what can we do here, and how? Right. So anybody want to start sharing around what they're doing, or what?
Well, Grant, I mean, you know, the casserole movements, right? Last night, will that continue?
Oh, yes.
Okay, is there a sketch? Is there a Wednesday night thing?
Well, yeah, June 6th, the next Wednesday, is the next major national call-out. This Saturday, there will be something going on. It's not 100% clear whether that's going to be in the evening or the afternoon. I'm rooting for the afternoon, because I think that's a lot more accessible for people.
Well, I think someone mentioned that there was something else going on in the afternoon on Saturday, the thing at Rob Adams or someone's office.
Yes, maybe time.
But then there was something else at 8 p.m. that people wanted to meet.
Yeah,
so I don't know.
I haven't checked since I got here and did my real check, so I don't know what status.
But you created
that'll be
page.
Yeah, that'll be posted on Facebook, on the Activist Network. And one of the things with the casseroles movement is it's not a centralized movement. So if somebody wants to just go out on their front step and start banging away on the pots at 8 p.m. any given night,
couple glasses of wine on there.
don't smash the glasses of wine.
Yeah.
That can hurt. In terms of many other actions, that slip of paper that Jen had passed around has links for, you can get on the web, Twitter, Facebook, email. You can subscribe to a calendar of events right into your calendar on your phone or computer. So ways to keep in touch with what's going on. But also, in terms of, those are places to go and put your ideas to as well. So if you want, there was somebody this morning who is in the Ogden community in Calgary and wants to do something just locally as a casserole there, and said, you know, hey, does anybody want to do that there? So once they've got that coming together, they'll post that up. And there's tons of other stuff to connect in with too. I mean, this issue crosses so many things. Like tomorrow we have the annual Speak Out. The Disability Action Hall is having its Disability Pride event, which is usually a really fantastic event. And tomorrow it's emphasizing around the right to transportation. So there's going to be some actions actually on the C train. So you can find that information on the links that were passed around. And there's tons of other stuff going on. But I see Maddie is
Yeah, I personally, since this, well, especially after last night, I'm planning on just carrying around like the tiniest plot I have, and wherever I am at 8 o'clock, I'm just gonna start banging it and see who recognizes it, or if I start conversations, because guaranteed someone out there is gonna be like, oh damn, that's in Calgary, yeah, like talk to me. So yeah, and just why not, just a little pocket
I
one.
do have to leave, and I had to leave about 15 minutes ago, but I just have a question for Ed. Is there any evidence or anecdotal even about agents of provocation involved in the protest movement?
I mean, there has been some. I think there's two things. I think there has been sort of, I think there was one night, for example, where people are like, oh, we're noticing that there's certain people who are really big and really who have these yellow things on their shoes and stuff like that. And there's a number of people, or so that, I mean, there has been sort of certain times where people have been like, oh, that's weird, or that's, you know, and definitely there has been history, right, of that as well.
Yeah.
I also
including
think,
recent history.
yeah, and I also think that there is this other thing around, because the violence of the police has been happening over a period of time, right? And so, I mean, it was in March when the first protester lost an eye because of being hit by a rubber bullet. And then, you know, in May, there were 2 or 3 other protesters who went to hospital in critical condition because they were randomly hit by something that the police had thrown at them. And there's now somebody in critical condition that, you know, right after the Law 78, who was brutalized by the police. Because there's a picture that was kind of passed around of him on the ground, like like, I think the ambulance are there, and he has a plastic wrist thing. And so what that means is that he was either like hit by the police before or after they put the handcuffs on, right? And he's still in critical condition. But there's no talk about these kinds of things in the media, right? And so when students do lash out and they are angry and they do you know, push back in more violent means, people don't understand why.
Yeah.
But if your friend or somebody you know who was literally peacefully in a march, like 1,000 feet away from the front lines, gets hit in the face and has to go into surgery or is in critical condition, it creates, like, people are going to get angry, right? People are going to get frustrated. And, you know, regardless of how you feel about, you know, violence, non-violence, whatever, like, I understand how people can react in different ways because of what's been happening. And so I think it's a combination of people responding, reacting to state violence. Some, you know, still like refusing to respond to violence and marching peacefully, etc. Like that's the majority. But there are people who are frustrated, angry, and are responding with violence. And then I think that there probably are certain agents provocateurs who, at certain periods of time, go, okay, we know that we need to clamp this down within an hour, and so we're going to have this thing happen in this isolated place over here, and that'll justify clamping down on everybody, which is basically what's been happening after you know, Law 78 happened. Was like I said, when I was marching, it was literally 45 minutes into it, thousands of people marching, and then the sound bumps were like off, and then people were like running everywhere, and then that gives further justification to clamp down, because all of a sudden you don't have one march, you have like 50 different marches of smaller groups of people, and it's easier then for police to kettle people too, right? So there's been a lot of kettling happening where police will just surround an entire group of people. There's one group of protesters I know who went to Victoriaville where the Liberal Party was meeting, and that's where the negotiations were, and that's where a lot of police violence happened. And they were arrested on the bus on the way back. So they weren't, I mean, they were there at the protest. They weren't arrested or anything, like, I'm sure that they were peaceful. And they were literally on the bus on the way back. The police stopped them, and they were on the bus for 6 hours. And the only reason why they didn't go to their prison was because they didn't have a prison at Victoriaville. So then they were just held basically for 6 hours. And now they're all being charged, right? For having participated in a protest that was deemed illegal, even though when they were there, they weren't, like, the police didn't interact with them, obviously, right? Because they were leaving, so, yeah.
In addition to the agent provocateur and people responding to state violence, there's a third one, which I've had some experience with, not as being one, but as Seaman, is people who are just looking to cause trouble in the community. think of it as sort of like the angry teenage boy syndrome,
Yeah.
who see a crowd and are like, okay, this is cover for me to go and do stuff. Right?
To me, that's more like if you go to the Stanley Cup, like what
Oh,
happened
yeah,
to
yeah,
the Stanley Cup, like in
sports
Vancouver,
riots,
Montreal.
sure.
That's more what I think of when. But
Yeah,
when
but
you
it
look
just
at
shows
the
you
yes.
the overreaction,
Yeah.
though, because we have a history, long history in Montreal of riots. Come on, look at Richard, for Christ's
Yeah.
sake. When it started, and all of a sudden, you need a friggin' law?
Yeah.
Asti, wow, shit. That's like bullshit.
The main protest sort of chant is on s'en calisse la loi spéciale.
Yeah.
So that's like the huge, yeah.
What's that in English?
That's like, we don't give a shit about this law.
It's a religious term
Yeah.
that's been used.
Yeah.
Now,
Even
there's lots of
the
those after the Revolution.
Globe and Mail, their thing was,
Yeah.
Globe and Mail, they said flip the bird. That's what they're doing.
We've got three more comments, but I think I just want to let people go who need to leave, and then we'll continue the conversation. Do you need to go, Brian?
I'll stick around.
Stick around and try to.
It's okay.
I want to say.
I would have fired my ass long ago.
If I can just.
We have a new job.
I just want to say a couple of thank yous before, because people will start to leave. I first of all want to thank Grant for helping me organize this, and Jen Len as well for helping with that. We kind of threw this together. And then Ed and Brian just sort of came on and said, yeah, we'll help out. And so it just sort of came together very quickly. I don't know if I've forgotten someone. And Peggy Askin, who
Yes.
will be here today because she's very sick. And so she's calling me at 7 a.m. saying, I'm so sorry I can't make it. So, and all of you for being here, and really a great respectful dialogue. Thank you so much.
A little round of applause for Lisa.
And please stay in touch through the information that's passed around.
Yeah, and I'll be in Montreal, going back to Montreal this summer, so I'll be there for a few months and connect with your connections and see what's going on. So I'll be sending information through. And as my own little subversive thing, now that I'm at the university teaching and doing my PhD, I'm really happy to get lots of things going on in the university setting as much as possible, because we tend to just ivory tower type of environment.
We tend?
So anything that's going on,
You wanna close the
bring
door?
it in here, please. I think that'd be great. So we'll just continue with the conversation, and I don't know who's next up, because I can't. Sure.
I think that also just in the discussion, I'm not going to take a stance on the nonviolence or diversity tactics, but you have to acknowledge the fact that black bloc tactics has a very long history, and it's not all about violence.
Oh, yeah.
So when you ban
Sorry, what was the term? Black ops?
black bloc, when
Black
you see
bloc.
people dressed in all black,
Oh, okay.
it's not all devoted to violence. You take a look at anarchist and commune struggles in Europe and self-defense struggles, especially in Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It wasn't actually about violence, it was about a show of solidarity and a show of like non-leadership and egalitarian politics. So I think that especially with the no masks law, it definitely is an affront, not just to people who want to cause trouble or like that sort of angry teenager syndrome, but it's also an affront to people who are more devoted to those radical politics and to that other history, that other genealogy that they're being painted as being just violence instead of having like a commitment to another political genealogy that's not mainstream. It's kind of a form of exclusion.
Also, too, I want to ask you, Ed, do you think we can, like, I do agree with what Grant is saying, there are troublemakers out there. Can we slough them off, or do we need to further understand why they're doing it? And maybe it is a representation of their lack of power that has been stolen by the state, and actually by acting out, they feel that they've reclaimed that power. And how does that relate to a broader struggle that we can take down these repressive institutions we have in society?
Even sociologically and ideologically, how some people could be that they're just misinformed, that they don't fully understand movements. This comes from a place of a lack of hope, because they're not more connected to things like this. So they feel like their only way of challenging the state or challenging neoliberal capitalism is through smashing the window instead of actually engaging in dialogue.
But
Because
can
they're so disconnected and disavowed.
Sorry, there was some, were you gonna?
I just wanted to respectfully say, in terms of anarchy or black bloc tactics, which I'm fine with, it's your personal expression, but I just notice a lot of co-opting of movements where the black bloc will come into another movement and do the violent things, and then it does look bad on the people who are there genuinely for civil and non-violent means. And I'm fine with the black bloc. I would just like to see more of a separation. Don't come into a group and co-opt it, because then you're detracting, you're not expanding the big circle.
It just point is that it's not a group, and if someone is coming in under that premise, then that it is the media perception that of that person, like that has been violent, that is affecting a lot of that. Like it has a lot to do with media perception, in my opinion.
I'm not saying
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah.
I'm just saying
Yeah.
I don't want this co-opting to continue in nonviolent movement.
Can I jump in?
Like the point is Black Bloc is not
It's-
a violent
it's
movement,
more
though.
politically-
I
It has been co-opted in its own way. Yeah.
I'd like to jump in if that's okay, because this is one of my major issues in the community. You know, and I'm going to say maybe some provocative things here. Most of the times when I've seen, because I've been at peacekeeper rallies, I've been involved for whatever number of years. Most of the time when there are acts of violence, it's usually white men. I just want to say that. And that scares me as a woman. So that's one thing, is men using violence scares me. Anyone, but mostly because I've seen too much violence. And then I have a child at a lot of these things, and like I've been involved, from the very first, the anti, white supremacist rallies and stuff, and have removed my daughter because I wasn't quite sure what people are going to do. And then the third thing is that I wonder if we talk about personal decisions and respecting them. So for me, it smacks of individualism, and this is the same individualism we're trying to actually fight or struggle against, to not use another word, a violent word. We're trying to struggle against the individualism that is actually creating the types of problems that we have in society about I get to do what I want and I don't care what anybody else thinks, because it's my personal view and values, and I've made this money and so I can spend it. And so those are some of the things. So I just wonder how much that individualism has seeped. I know not everyone's going to agree with this, but how much it's seeped into our community of activists under we're different, we can do what we want, but in some sense we're replicating some of the same forces that we're trying to struggle against. And so I have a lot more to say, but I will open it up for lots of comments.
Well, that's dangerous too, because it's based on a moral position.
Yeah.
So it's giving, even a higher, loftier, heady position.
Yeah.
I'm fighting for the cause.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
And one
So
last thing I just have
that's
to
the
say
danger.
around the anti-racist stuff is when I put the call out, I think there was a few of us that put the call out for the very first meeting. I called all of my friends in various racialized communities, and people came out from all the different communities and were part of that. I mean, it was awesome, right? The Somali community was there, the Sudanese community, like we had everybody there, the Filipinos, the Nepalese. And then guess what? Nobody's coming to these things.
They all left.
And they've told me why.
Exactly.
And so I just want to say that, that's all I want to say.
Thank you for saying that.
I'll just, the idea of diversity of tactics, for me, usually I'm in support of diversity of tactics. It's a really long discussion, and I don't know if we can have it entirely here, because it's really complicated, and I understand that there's differing opinions and stuff like that. And I understand your concerns. I think that for me, like when I do my own sort of analysis or decision making, I do think about it in a context specific sort of thing, and so it's not like, for me, I wouldn't 100% support every action every single time and place and location, because it just doesn't necessarily work. But I don't know if that's, I think the one thing that, part of what you talked about, which was this idea of like, what happens when a group of people don't have a political avenue to express their anger, frustration of the kinds of oppression they might be experiencing. And I think that's a really valid thing to think about as to why people are doing it. So not just say, well, this is wrong, but to ask that question of why.
But isn't it similarly disrespectful for them to come into a place where other people have put so much time and they should be putting their own time in? It's disrespectful to the people who organized the event.
Hold on, let me finish my thought.
Sorry.
I'm not talking about the Black Bloc. So
Neither am I. I'm just saying in general, people who co-opt, who didn't invest the time in organization, coming in at the end and doing it for their own personal, like you're saying, ego reasons.
Yeah, which is a fair thing. Just if I could finish my thought, which is, I'm not thinking about the Black Bloc in this case. Like I'm thinking more about some of the uprisings that have happened in Montreal over the last decade, specifically around the issue of racial oppression. And so, you know, and it makes me think of, you know, I think the poor and working class racialized communities in Montréal Nord, which is like North Montreal, which is very highly racialized. And I think 2 years ago, there was, I mean, it's happened a number of times, but most recently there was, the police killed a youth, Freddie Villanueva, and there was a huge level of uprising that happened. And so, and part of that uprising, there was a degree of violence there, right? So there were like fires and stuff like that. And I think, to me, like when I look at that context, to understand the history of racial oppression within the racialized communities in Montréal Nord, and then this response, which was a more sort of like, what's the word? It was just, it just kind of happens spontaneously, like it wasn't sort of planned. It just happened, and it was a way for people to express the frustration they were feeling around the kind of racial profiling and state violence that they had been experiencing over a number of years, right? And so, yeah, I mean, for me, it's more around, you know, I think that question of asking why is important. And when we ask that question why, that's when I start to say, well, okay, in some cases it makes sense, but in other cases, like, for example, there was like a group of 4 people, which I don't even think were really affiliated with the student movement, and they kind of like smoke bombed the metro, and it totally like shut down the metro, and I'm like, you know,
And they had someone had died. We having a very different.
And they weren't like black people. They weren't like, it was just like a group of 4 random students, and I don't even know how they were connected. I do think that actually the city of Montreal purposely shut down the metro for 2 hours, because what I've heard from other reports is that it should only take like 20 minutes to like stop a smoke bomb from and removing it and allowing it to happen. So I think that something fishy was happening there in terms of the response of what happened.
In the context of 9/11,
but
I mean, you know,
yeah, but they've done that before, like previously, where they have been smoke bombed, and they have been able to have the system running for like really fast within like 20 minutes. This was like a 2-hour long wait, and it was all the metro lines stopped. And it's just that kind of
I know,
thing.
but you can't like on the one hand use
understand.
historical rendering and then not use it. So, you know, like the FLQ, the War Measures Act, I mean, that's the whole context in which we approach to our security in Montreal.
Yeah, for sure.
So, you know, as children, if you have children and taking a subway,
yeah,
I mean, I'm there every summer. I wouldn't think I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify what I was saying earlier. I was mostly just speaking in Black Bloc in terms of like the history and the people who are actually using that with the intent of that's behind Black Bloc, not just like people wearing black and co-opting a movement, or in any other cases, any other variety of examples that could be used. I wasn't, so I do agree with you.
As well, I wasn't
totally
speaking about Black Bloc.
I just mostly, that was
broadly saying any individual who comes in with their own agenda and seems to have disrespect for the people who organized it with a particular vision, and at the last minute, if it's violence or whatever it is that they end up.
It happens a lot.
There's 1, 2, 3 comments.
I'm going to use the word aggression. I'm not a big fan of using the word violence, but I realize how dominant that word is within our discourse. I find that the whole context of violence, nonviolence is a Eurocentric construct that trivializes the struggles of non-white people around the world. So I'm going to use aggression rather than violence. And I've been, first I want to use the example of Quebec City, 2001. The organizers did their darndest to make sure that there was a green zone, a yellow zone, and a red zone. And everybody knew that red zone, you're probably going to get arrested. Yellow zone, probably not. Green zone, definitely, but the cops didn't care. They went down to the green zone where Food Not Bombs was, and threw them all in jail and tear gassed them all anyway. Secondly, I wanted to mention the last major arrest that I was involved in was a action against a trade agreement in Halifax that was organized by anarchists, hardcore anarchists, and we made sure that people knew in the community that this was being organized by anarchists. It's going to be confrontational. There's probably going to be stuff thrown at the cops. And we made our darndest attempts to deviate, to make sure that the Black Bloc was at the end of the march, and then turned over and made sure that the safe space was available for everybody to express themselves. And at the end of it, who gets targeted, who gets tarnished? It's the ones that claim, non-aggression is is the monopoly right of all expression. You guys are bad. You brought this on yourself. You should have known better. It's like, hello, we did. And then you look at Seattle. Same thing happened in Seattle. It's like it was mostly the non-aggressive people that got aggressive against the people that were dismantling property. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we don't acknowledge that within the totality of the human condition, aggression is an aspect of it. And when you don't acknowledge it and pretend it doesn't exist, you're more likely to blow up when you're faced with that kind of confrontation.
Also, I just want to bring up another situation that I know of, is I have friends who are involved in the struggle, and it kind of smacks in the face of like those ones where nonviolence and aggression are kind of like opposed. The struggle at the Olympics in Vancouver, actually, and I know some friends who are involved in Black Bloc struggles, and they were encouraged by Native leaders to go to the front of the movements because they were seen as a way of detracting from state violence, because the state thought that the Black Blockers I knew were actually non-aggressive. They believed in nonviolence, but they believed in Black Bloc as a tactic of self-identification and of self-preservation, and in that context, it was actually very effective in terms of protecting the larger rally and kind of signifying it as a specific struggle. And I think that I agree with you. There are a lot of people who co-opt Black Bloc tactics, but I think that it's really dangerous to moralize it, because once, like something really problematic I've seen emerging from the Occupy movement is people wanting to demask Black Blockers, and really, even if it might be people trying to co-opt it, it still isolates them further. It doesn't create an inclusive atmosphere, and I think that's what should be more encouraged is opening up a dialogue with them. And if they are agent provocateurs, then isolate them in such a way that you know that they are, like be sure that they are. Because
like in Montebello.
Like in Montebello, yeah, exactly. And, yeah, I think that it's just the problem I have is the moralization of certain movements and the way that they depict all violence or everything associated with Black Bloc or more confrontational tactics as being immoral or reinforcing the states. And that's kind of problematic because it tends to isolate a lot of individuals and doesn't even give them the
Can you see the other side, how it actually isolates people who are against that tactics?
Yeah. Totally depends on the situation.
Also, Pastor Grant, I think, has been waiting for a while.
For me, the concern I have with what has become the mainstream definition of diversity of tactics in activism is that it has been passed through the filter of U.S. individualism. For me, diversity of tactics, the origin, the very valuable origin, is the recognition of things like, it's not our place here to say to the Zapatistas they shouldn't take arms to defend their communities. It's not up to us to say to the Mohawks in Oka, you can't take up arms because they as a community did that. But the key thing for me there is that it's community tactics. The frustration that I have with what has become the mainstream definition of diversity of tactics is it's this libertarian, I can do whatever the hell I want at any event I want without consideration, as you're talking about, that sort of co-optation thing of coming into a space and just arbitrarily of my own volition changing what the space is going to be. Now I, as somebody who does a lot of organizing, I'm not of the position that what I organize needs to be my vision, because that's not very democratic either. But that if people are going to come in and change an event that I've been a part of organizing, it needs to be a change that happens through collective dialogue, through the building of a community consensus to make that change.
But how do you do that effectively? Like I was up on the road in Kananaskis where we had a 3-hour discussion because there were latecomers to it that said, we want to camp. But the organizers said, well, we've decided that we're not going to camp today. And it was like, well, and the first people to leave were the unionists because they're always the ones, I hate to be stereotypical, but they seem to always be the ones that get really tired. So how do you do it effectively?
Well, how I do it effectively is by not taking that approach of assuming that the way an event has been planned is the way it must be carried out.
I mean, I don't know about Calgary, the activist culture here. I'm not super, like, I think I'm getting a glimpse of it, like, and even at the Judy Rubik thing, I think I got a glimpse of it too, but I mean, in Montreal, my understanding, I mean, people have differences of opinion around the Black Bloc, diversity of tactics, etc. But for the most part, when a march is identified as family friendly, like when it's like clearly like, okay, this march is family friendly, that it's like 99% out of 100, it's like usually very much respected that it will be a certain peaceful march, right? And that's every time I've gone to a march where they said this is a family friendly march, it's almost entirely been respected. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I don't know about the, and yeah, to me, like there's a difference between talking about the Black Bloc, like specifically, and talking about pro and con, et cetera, like that to me is like this very context-specific conversation that it's hard for me to have an opinion about, because sometimes I'm maybe like, okay, it makes sense, but other times I'm like, okay, that really doesn't make sense at all. But when we talk about like understanding violence and responses to state violence, to me on a broader level, that's where I can understand why the response to when people respond to state violence with violence, I can understand that. Because I mean that's also the history of the world too, right? Like I mean my parents were Korean immigrants, and during the 60s, 70s, 80s it was a U.S.-backed Korean dictatorship for like 3 decades, and like my father participated in storming, like occupying like people's, like the leaders, like politician leaders' buildings and stuff like that, and he wasn't thinking, well, I'm violent, non-violent, I'm Black Bloc, I'm not Black Bloc. He was thinking, I'm being repressed by the state. My rights are being trampled on. I have no rights. Like I can't. There were like things that were being like songs that were being like so there's all this level of censorship and brutality, etc. And so it was just this sort of response to that, right? Which I think if you look at like most of the world that post 1960, which is like post-colonialism and but also a lot of dictatorships like globally. I mean there were so many uprisings that happened in so many different places, and and part of those uprisings were sometimes considered in our terms violent, in other terms non-violent, right? But there's also a lot of trauma and death that happened through those movements as well, which is why there's so many immigrants, I think, here who have that history, but are really, really reticent of participating in movements where there might be violence because they've had that experience or their parents have. Even though like so many, I think, immigrants here, especially from Central South America, Asia and Africa, have a really deep understanding of state oppression and state violence, whether it's through colonialism or through dictatorship. And so, yeah.
Good points.
Just to build on that point, I can't really speak about that so much because I'm personal history, but one of the things that really worries me with things like liberal nonviolent discourse, especially in activist movements, is that the tendency to reference history and to whitewash it, especially when they reference things like the Indian independence struggle and the civil rights struggle, and it tends to whitewash it as being only nonviolent because of the quotes of some predominant leaders, and they write off the role that diversity tactics, or let's be honest, aggression, had in those movements, at least the threats of violence had, that someone like Martin Luther King can make reference to the Nation of Islam or other more radical groups and say that if you don't bargain with us, if you don't bargain with us being nonviolent, then we do have this, like this is what can come because we're going to react with the same amount of violence that you're pushing on us. So I think that that's my major fear. As much as I respect pacifism, and I have a profound respect for it because I am a pacifist myself, my fear is that we tend to whitewash history and say that all struggles must be nonviolent.
I wanted to jump in. I think for myself, I'm just thinking about like having supported the Mohawk uprising and also like the Spear of the Nation during the anti-apartheid times. I think that for me, what I'm more concerned about is what are our social contracts with each other as a community. That's what's more important to me than like anything. If anyone decides in the middle that I'm going to do whatever, I remember I think you were one of the peacekeepers in one of the anti-war in Iraq rallies. And there was a group of young men that started basically beating on all the peacekeepers They just decided they were angry and they started, it was terrible. And my partner, who's Iranian, got called every name in the book. I mean, it was terrible what happened. And we had no process of dealing with this type of thing. And everyone who was a sort of a peacekeeper at that point decided they didn't want to be a peacekeeper at any other rallies. So we lost about 15, 20 people because they were so disrespected and the community didn't know what to do. So my question, my father made an interesting comment that, and I think I shared that in class around around how our human rights charter just enshrines individual rights, doesn't enshrine social responsibilities and social contracts, and how that charter is flawed, highly flawed in that context. And I thought that's a great comment that he made, and I agree with it. And so I guess as a smaller community, what's our social contract to each other, to the well-being of each other, to making kind of even stopping on the road and making a decision and talking it out till it's done, right? And that kind of thing. And maybe it takes more time, and we're all busy in the capitalist upstream of efficient and effective activist movements and actions where we don't have time to talk either. So I guess that's to take it out of the, nonviolent action pacifism. I don't want to, it's not that. I do get quite nervous when I don't have social contracts with others around me, and mostly in my history, it's been white guys who decide to start acting violent, freak me out, and that bothers me. I have to say it bothers me. And but if I have social contracts and relationships with people, and we've made decisions as a community, that's going to feel really different. And I'll know when to take my daughter and go, right?
Yeah.
So.
Sorry, I just before we all go to it, just a couple, because you talked about what next, and a couple interesting things that have happened. Like I would just really encourage people to do like really creative things as well. And so, like be willing to engage in dialogue, but also don't be afraid of like a bit of conflict as well, because sometimes conflict can engage and spark dialogue or change. Like there's some marches, for example, where people would march on the street, like a group of 20 people, and then they would like lie down like as if they were dead in front of like a bank or something, and then there was an anti-racist action that I was a part of where we went to the park and we had all these, we made these silhouettes and had this sort of education, not deportation sign, and like we had like facts around sort of the racialization of poverty and the feminization of poverty, and the impact on the tuition hikes on racialized women, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, that was kind of like our action, which in the context of, Law 78, it was actually considered illegal because there was more than 50 people over there and we didn't tell the police what we're doing. And so, we're doing that kind of thing too. And also, whatever action you do, try to make it visible. So try to take a photo, try to take a video, because then you can pass it online through Facebook, through Twitter, and people in Quebec actually do, pay attention. Like, there's tons of videos and videos, which vice versa, right? People here, that's how a lot of you have a better understanding of what's happening in Montreal, is like through the Facebook and Twitter and videos and stuff. But there was the march that happened yesterday, and we passed it out, and I think there's hundreds of people in Quebec who now know there's a group of people in Calgary who participated in that march, like I have hundreds. Like there's a friend of mine.
We were lucky to have Judy Revick with us, who has a large following and tweeted that out.
Yeah,
she was in that march.
Yeah. There's a friend of mine who's francophone who knows nobody in Alberta, and he said, there's 2 people that he knew who forwarded it onto their friends before he even forwarded it.
Oh,
so
there's you that said that.
Yeah. So I think it's, I don't underestimate that and the power of the social media to be able to communicate what you're doing, no matter how small it might be.
Well, the other part that goes with that is that when we show people that we're doing this stuff, it shows people that it's possible to do this stuff.
For sure.
And so if you go out in your neighborhood and you're banging the pot in the sidewalk in front of your house, it shows your neighbors that it can be done.
Yeah, exactly. Great.
Well, I think that goes back to when we were talking about just having the courage and at Judy's event, just in terms of lots of people might have it within themselves, or they might recognize that there's a problem, but they're just terrified or don't even know that what's stopping them is their own fear. It's the system has told us we aren't empowered, which thank you, Occupy taught me that's a load of crap.
Like create affinity groups and do small actions and then promote it online. And like and you never know. Like there's some small actions that were organized in Montreal by literally like 3 or 4 people, and then hundreds of people went, right, and participated. And so it's just, it's very, like just like don't be afraid to try those things. And also like do things like this, right? Like panels and discussions and workshops and stuff like that. I think that's like really, really, really important.
And along with that is don't be discouraged when you organize stuff that almost nobody shows up to.
Yeah.
Because I have organized so many events, and I've done protests where I was the only one who showed up. I did the critical mass bike ride by myself.
If you go and you organize and you're the only one showing up, just call yourself a Buddhist and you'll be